when we were just first starting to homeschool and I was reading a whole bunch of educational philosophy, I just actually did not believe that there was a natural intrinsic desire to know. When I started out with the assumption that it's my job to make them do the work that they don't want to do, then strategies that are basically manipulation and bribing make sense.
Welcome to Scalay Sisters, where we are cultivating the maximum number of thinking moms we can. This is the podcast for classical homeschooling mamas who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. Scalay Sisters discusses topics that matter to those of us who believe that educating ourselves through reading widely, thinking deeply, and applying faithfully equips us for the task of educating our children. I'm your host, Brandy Venzel. To get my free, almost weekly, mostly Charlotte Mason newsletter, go to afterthoughtsblog.net/subscribe and sign up. My co-hosts today are Mystie Winkler and Abby Wall. Mystie is a homeschooling mom of 5, including 2 graduates. She writes and podcasts at simplyconvivial.com and is the author of 2 excellent books, The Convivial Homeschool and Simplified Organization. Abby is basically the queen of the Scalay sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer, rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whenever she can. Don't forget to register for our annual spring training sessions. This is happening soon. Our coach this year is Andrew Zwerneman from Cana Academy. Andrew is going to teach 2 sessions on history. The first session will help us get away from Marxism and adopt a classical view of history. The second session will propose a method for teaching history. To register, just go to scolaysisters.com/history to sign up. That's scolaysisters.com/history. In today's episode, Mystie, Abby, and I discuss rewards and how to connect them to intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation. You're gonna love this conversation. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scalay Everyday. Who would like to go first?
I'll go first. This is Mystie, and I am currently maybe 3/4 of the way through a small book called Acedia and Me, and I double-checked. I Googled how to pronounce it.
I have that book, and I feel like it dovetails with the topic that I have put it off for like 7 years.
And I just realized I misspoke. Acedia and Me, I read years and years ago, like more than 10 years ago, by Kathleen Norris.
Right.
Right now, the book I am reading is Acedia and Its Discontents.
Oh.
Subtitle, Metaphysical Boredom in an Empire of Desire.
What?
Ooh.
That's an amazing title.
R.J. Snell. So
that's Amy Snell's husband.
Is it?
Yeah. So Amy Snell does the CMEC.
Yeah.
And her husband is a philosopher.
Well, this is an amazing book.
Yeah, he's quite great. I watched a training from him and he was spectacular.
Well, I'm impressed with his ability to title a book. Let me tell you.
I know. I mean, that's why I bought it. I'm like, well, it's Angelico Press. On the back, it has a blurb by Anthony Esselin and Peter Kreeft.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I was like, well, so I've owned it for several years. And I'm finally reading. It sounded like a February book. We're recording this in February.
That's true.
And it really is. It really is. So it's very convicting. And his bibliography, like the books that he's referencing, I've read several of them. And it's just really wide ranging. He has, of course, Aquinas and Augustine, Wendell Berry and Hilaire Belloc, Robert Farrar Capon, The Supper of the Lamb, which we've referenced before in an episode. Chesterton, but also George Grant, a book by David Bruce Hegeman, Plowing in Hope, that I read years and years ago.
Oh, I read that too.
He references Kuiper. He does reference Kathleen Norris, who wrote Acedia and Me, and Pieper, Charles Taylor, which I've been seeing referenced everywhere. So I really feel like I need to read Charles Taylor now.
Yeah, I've seen it a bunch of places too. So it must be the next thing we must read after R.J. Snell.
It's just really, really well written. It's been a fun read, even though it is about metaphysical boredom. It's not boring.
I wonder why he didn't ask you to write a dust jacket.
It's not boring.
Sorry.
It's my plug.
Yeah.
All right. I just added it to my wish list. I'm not spending money. I'm spending money in the future.
Yeah. You're building fences and bookcases. You can't afford to buy more books.
Oh my gosh. I'm bleeding money. I'm like, let's just spend it all. Then we won't.
I just was thinking about your pictures of your fence building, and I was like, oh man, we totally do that for so much less money. I know how much those fencers cost. So
I know. It's really well, my daughter was like, what things would you like to learn? I really want to learn to weld. And I'm like, could you do it by next week so you can make the fence? She's like, I don't think you can learn it that fast, Mom.
You can actually. I took a semester at college. It was great, actually.
You just need to fly Abby out and she'll build your fence.
That's right. My crew, we could take care of things for you. So
wow, I didn't think about that option.
Yeah. Okay, well then it's Abby and it's my turn, and I'm reading something far less lofty, but very important, I think. So we're changing things up in our high schoolers' Sunday school. We've decided to separate the boys and girls for a while.
Oh, what a great idea.
Yeah, I think so too. And instead of doing just the, kind of prescribed Sunday school material that like basically the entire church does, because that's what big churches do and things like that, we've decided to read a book together, just me and the girls. And we are reading Lies Young Women Believe by Nancy DeMoss Wolgemuth and Dana Gresh. And so we're going to kind of take turns reading it aloud and then have a discussion. And then we've also pulled in a couple of the young adults from the next class up that we call them Yanks, young adults, no kids. And so to kind of foster in some maybe like more Titus 2 kind of mentoring things so that we have just a really good little group of gals, because we have a very big Sunday school group for our youth and it's pretty active, but some of the girls were saying like, well, we never really talk about things. Nobody says anything. It's really awkward, and so we're like, well, then let's separate them and let's, talk and do some things. So the book just goes through some of the lies that our culture is selling to them. And a lot of our kids are homeschooled, but a lot of them go to private schools. And there's very few, but there are still a few that go to public school. And so they are hearing the cultural things. And after the pandemic, like so many people went to private schools that were not church-based because they were the only schools open. So these Christian schools have had a lot of infiltration of, secular, they're supposed to go to church, but they don't always police that.
Right.
So I think it'll be really good. So it talks about, lies about social media, lies about sin, lies about Satan, lies about relationships, and then also just the truth that sets you free. I know that the adult version was very good. I read it, I think, years ago, and I think it was very, very helpful. So I think it will be really good. There is one chapter we're going to skip because it's a little bit more than we want to maybe tackle. And because we have a big age range, some of the younger girls may have never even heard of some of this stuff. I mean, granted, probably they've heard of more than, we want to think to admit, but I would never want to put anything into someone's mind that isn't quite ready for it. Because some of these kids have been pretty sheltered and pretty, protected life. And that's something. So I told all the moms that and said, they all get to take the book home and you can read it and see if it's something that, you think they should read. So
that's great.
That's how we're handling it.
Sounds really good to me.
Yeah.
You remind me of Leonard Sachs. I don't know if you've ever read anything by him, but he, for a long time, was leading a movement to try to create boys' schools and girls' schools just because of, he believed that everybody learned better in a sex segregated environment. At least when you're young. I don't know if he would say that about adults. But anyway, it just reminds me of how separating, we used to do that at our youth group for part of the time. We'd separate into boys and girls. And I just think it was really good for us as teenagers to not have just the distraction of boys.
I'm very hopeful, and everybody seems to be pretty excited about it. So parents and the girls that I've talked to. So it seems to be a good thing. And I've been looking through this book. I haven't read everything yet, but it does seem to hit on some really important points that you just don't think about. And it would be really good because most of these kids do have social media and, are engaging online. And so just having some parameters that align with God's truth is always good to have, to talk about. So.
How about you, Brandy?
Mine is, gosh, I'm looking at the title and I'm like, I don't know if I'm going to say this right. Taliesin, I guess.
I thought it was Taliesin.
Taliesin, great. Taliesin by Stephen Lawhead. See, I've never heard that word before in my life, so I knew I was going to botch it. I read 2 Lawhead books last year. I read Byzantium and I read Patrick, and they were both excellent. And Byzantium, I just feel like deserves worldwide acclaim. I fell absolutely in love with it. It was so good. And so I was thinking I wanted to read more Lawhead. He has 2 main genres that he writes in. One is historical fiction and one is fantasy. The 2 that I read were both historical fiction. I want to try some of his fantasy. So I've had a number of people recommend the Pendragon cycle to me. So I decided, well, I will start it.
Is it Pendragon? Because I always thought it was Pendragon.
It might be.
Well, I don't want it to be wrong. This is what
I
happens
feel
when
like
you read
maybe
things in
I
your
don't
head.
even say Stephen Lawhead correctly.
Well, my brain just always saw it as like a compound word. It's a Pendragon.
Yeah, that's
how
what I thought.
See, and I'm like, I just imagined my pen turning into some sort of creature and freaking me out. So anyway, I really have no idea. I mean, this is the danger of only reading words and never hearing them spoken aloud, right?
True.
Anyway, so I actually am even thinking of making Lawhead a 5x5 category and trying to read 5 of his books. The reason it's intimidating is because, I mean, even this one, which is one of his smaller ones, is 486 pages with really tiny font. It's no joke to read a Lawhead book. But I'm feeling like I'm probably going to read, just from the move and everything, I feel like more fiction is probably a better decision anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And just, it's a little easier for me to read. Plus, escapist fiction when you're overwhelmed.
Yeah.
It's totally healthy. Totally healthy. Anyway, I haven't decided if I'm going to make it a 5x5 category yet, but I'm heading that direction by trying this one book and seeing how it goes.
That works.
I just got it in the mail. I haven't started it yet. It came, I think, yesterday. So I'm very excited about it because I love his writing.
Hi, Abby here to invite you to join us in Sistership. It is the place for homeschooling moms to talk about all things homeschool, educational philosophy, books, and how to avoid burnout. Sistership is private and free. Free from ads, free from drama, and free to join. We wanted a place, no matter where we live, to find thinking mothers to discuss ideas, to become equipped and confident, and to not take ourselves too seriously. Sistership will encourage you to read widely, think deeply, and apply faithfully all that you are learning. So, join us for the camaraderie and stay for the fun.
Today, we're going to discuss something that we have talked about before. I looked it up. We talked about this topic with Karen Glass in our podcast episode 67, which was called Death by Sticker Chart. And then we talked again with Jason Barney, and that was episode 119. And we called that one Rewards Revisited. And I guess we could call this one Rewards Revisited again.
The remix.
I feel like
it's
maybe,
Rewards Remix.
There we go. That's right. That's right. We had a guest on for both of those. So I was like, today we have another special guest. It's our book. And the book is Drive by Daniel Pink. And it's all about motivation. Really, that is the whole issue with rewards. When we're setting up a reward system in our homes or in a classroom, it's because we are trying to motivate our students or our children. We're really going to get into motivation, some of the science behind motivation, some of the anthropology, to throw in a big word. Yeah.
Pronounced correctly.
Maybe. I'm doubting myself today. Let's just start with some definitions because he starts right off contrasting extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. So we're probably going to be using those words, but I want to make sure we've established a definition because, I mean, there could be some people listening who haven't even heard of those descriptors before.
Yeah, I'm excited just to be on this episode because I was not on either of those other episodes. This is my first time getting to talk about rewards.
So Misty is like going to really talk a lot about all of her opinions on these things. But
Would you like to
let me tell you.
Because Jason Barney and I basically have the same reading list, and
you're like the same person. He's like your male doppelganger or something.
Yeah.
Who was with me with Karen?
Karen, I was with Karen too.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
Okay.
You guys have had all the fun.
Well, I'm sorry, Misty, you've been left out all these years. So
I'm not.
sad.
She's gotten some really great guests too. So, Brandy is the only one who really can apologize to either.
That's true.
She gets to be on everything.
So intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, I think, are just really helpful categories that we often don't maybe even realize that they are different categories. And we just think it's just motivation, period.
Right.
And to think about it in two different kinds of motivation, I think is super helpful. So those two categories of motivation were categories I first heard of when I read Drive, like more than 10 years ago. Daniel Pink, the author of the book, definitely has some anthropology issues that muddle up the way he talks about motivation. But these categories of extrinsic versus intrinsic, I find really, really helpful as I think about motivating my kids and also myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Extrinsic are what we typically think of with rewards or carrots or sticker charts. We're adding something extra. It's not related to the activity itself. It's an add-on. So it's extrinsic. It's outside of the actual behavior that you are trying to reward, that you are trying to get someone to do. You're trying to motivate them to do something. And so you add on some kind of extra prize at the end. This is like taking people out to ice cream, having chocolate, giving ourselves chocolate, buying a pair of shoes, going out for a pedicure, like these kinds of, I'm just going to go do something fun that I want after I do the thing I don't want to do. That would be an extrinsic motivator. And I think sticker charts generally count as extrinsic motivators. Like the sticker has nothing to do with whatever we're trying to get our kid to do, their chores or the reading lesson or the whatever. It's something extra. And then intrinsic motivation can be really difficult to nail down. It's difficult to find within ourselves, much less trigger in someone else. And that's why we tend to gravitate to the extrinsic motivations. Intrinsic motivation is that just desire to do something because you want it. It's fun, it's interesting, it's rewarding in itself. The motivation is wrapped up in your person and in the task. You just are drawn to it, and so you want to do it. And it's really the gold standard. It's the more motivating, more rewarding kind of motivation that we really should be trying to tap into, but it's way harder to tap into.
The way I remember these two, because even though I haven't read Drive before, it wasn't my first encounter with the words themselves. When I was first trying to get them straightened out in my brain, I remembered them as extrinsic being external motivation, so outside of me, and intrinsic being internal motivation, meaning it's coming from inside of me.
Yeah.
In our original episode, actually, we might have even talked about this with Karen Glass, but I know with Jason Barney, the idea of manipulation came up. And one of the things we talked about was the idea of rewards being manipulative.
Yeah.
But actually, in Pink's book, he makes room for rewards that are manipulative and then rewards that are not manipulative. That's another clarification that we could make as we're starting. How would you define manipulation, you guys?
Well, when you're trying to control someone, I think that was a big distinction for me. Oftentimes we think, well, we're just trying to affirm a positive behavior through this. But what we're really trying to do is get them to do what we want. And we're trying to control the means and where, when, and why, and how, right? So it is really a controlling thing. And that is where I think the manipulation comes. When we have that external force, it isn't really giving them the autonomy or choice. It's do this. It's if this, then this. And he does talk about this, Daniel Pink. Sometimes we think, oh, I'm not being manipulative. But anytime I want to control a behavior, an outcome, anytime I'm trying to plant that on a child or things like that, that's when I know I'm being manipulative. And I have to call myself out on it and repent of that. Trying to control someone else is not only not possible long-term, right? We have moments where we can control others, but it doesn't actually translate into the behavior we actually want. But controlling others, I have to control myself, and controlling others is not actually my job.
I had never really contrasted motivation with manipulation directly, even though I've seen these two things as related when it comes to rewards. Maybe we're telling ourselves sometimes that we're trying to motivate when really we're trying to manipulate.
Mm-hmm.
The word motivation itself, what is there? And we have this idea of like you're trying to get something to move, right?
Yes.
Like that's what the Latin root is in there. You're trying to move something. But with manipulation, you're trying to handle something.
Yeah.
And maybe even like manhandle something. Right? You know,
So the Manny.
I think with motivation, there's still, even with some extrinsic motivation, there's still autonomy in the person who's being motivated.
Yeah.
So like their humanity is being respected in some way versus in manipulation. What am I doing? I'm trying to impose my will on someone. I'm trying to get my way. And so I'm not just trying to move them. I'm trying to get them to do exactly what I want, the way that I want it. And I know that's what you said, Abby. I just had this moment where I realized how different that is from what motivation really means.
Yep.
And I guess there is a little bit of direction. When we think of the carrot and stick thing, there is a little bit of a direction, right? Because the ultimate thing with the donkey and the stick, it's like, well, you pointed the stick in the way you want the donkey to move. The whole implication behind the donkey is they can't be moved very easily, right? When they don't want to be, when they've decided they don't want to be moved. Anyway, I guess that is like a stubborn child, but anyway. So rewards could be manipulative, but then
they don't have to be.
No, but that's more to do with me than the method.
The reward. Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
The reward itself.
Yeah. My intentions, my motive, like my own personal interest in this situation, right?
Well, maybe that's the first gut check thing that we can do when we're doing things like this. How much of this is just me trying to get everyone around me to do the dance that I want them to do? When I've gotten into discussions with people about this issue, one thing that when I'm speaking with Christians that they come back around to is, well, then how do you say we completely get rid of rewards? Which I don't actually say that, but it can sound that way depending on what just came out of my mouth. But it's like, how can you say we completely get rid of rewards when God obviously rewards his people? There's immediate rewards and blessings that come with obedience, but then there's, things like, oh, I don't know, heaven. That's very, it's very motivating and it's very much a reward. God is not manipulating you. He's not treating you like a robot. And so maybe that's part of the difference is that God can be trusted to give a healthy reward and we can't always.
That's right. And God is just and gives grace abundantly, right? Like, and perfect. So and I am not. So, but it also too is like, what is the verse? If your Father here can give good gifts, how much more can your Father in heaven, right? Like we have been created to give good things to our kids, right? There is that innate sense of wanting to reward children for good. Like we want to do good, right? I think there is that because that's like our Father in heaven and we want to emulate and be like him.
Pink starts off his early chapters. So if anybody's listening to this and hasn't read the book, we're really talking about chapters 1 through 3, which is 4 chapters because there's a chapter 2A, which I think is hilarious.
Yep.
Why we didn't go back and renumber the chapters, I don't know. But He talks about, quote, economic man, like it's capital E, capital M, economic man, like it's a thing. And this is really funny because years ago, I read Peter Drucker's book at the end of Economic Man without realizing that that was like a thing.
Yeah.
And I didn't fully connect that it was a thing until today.
When you're reading.
And I was like, oh, I mean, I understood what Drucker was talking about, but I didn't realize that economic man was a category. I haven't read enough economics from that particular time period to realize that was a category or a definition or an anthropological understanding that had an official capital E, capital M title.
So that's the understanding that people are motivated by self-interest primarily, right?
Mm-hmm. One of the ways I thought was interesting when he talked about $5 and he talked about like you're being given, or maybe it was more than that anyway, but you're being given $5.
Inflation.
Yeah, really. Maybe it was $10. Anyway, but there's like money that they're supposed to share, right?
Yeah.
And people are willing to share it with you when it's a little bit uneven, but if it gets too uneven, let's say it's $10. I'm going to give you $2 and keep $8. Most people will say no to that. They'll be like, no, you just keep it. And his whole thing was that actually undermines this idea of economic men where everything is a calculation and everything's a transaction, because you would be in a better place if you accepted the $2, even though it's not $8, it's not $4, it's not closer to half than it is, but you would actually just be better. So why not just take it? But most people won't. And it's because there's something else going on here. So it turns out there's more to man than just being calculating.
Right.
Obviously, as Christians, we believe that anyway.
Yeah, we're actually motivated by more than just pure self-interest.
Mm-hmm.
Which that idea that man is motivated primarily by self-interest, I think goes along with that early modern conception of man as a machine.
Yeah.
So we can mathematically predict what people will or should do in this mechanistic way.
Mm-hmm.
It just turns out that man is not mechanistic.
Not to get too far off the topic, but I was even thinking about how that understanding might then inform our understanding of what goes on in this war between the sexes with the whole feminism thing. Because if you define man as only seeking his own self-interest and you do that strictly enough, then he's actually not seeking the good of his children. He's not seeking the good of he's literally seeking the good of himself. That's what the ultimate calculating person would be doing. When we talk about being motivated by self-interest, I look at my husband, I think there's a lot of things that are motivated by self-interest, but I don't mean literally just him. I mean, he wants to take care of his family. Well, that's a lot more people than just him.
Right.
He's thinking up to my parents and his parents. He's thinking down to his children and future grandchildren. There's so much more going on than just him and what he wants or how much he can make or get out of the situation or whatever. I would still call it somewhat self-interest, but only because as a Christian, I view part of yourself as the way that you're related to people. Like I believe God puts you in a family, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he has an office
Right.
that connects him to other people.
Right. Perhaps part of the resentment, I'm sure that feminism also is based upon resentment that comes from real world experience with really awful people. I'm sure that's part of it. But I think also, if you accept that definition of a man and view him as this two-dimensional transactional creature, that's not a very pleasant way to view someone when you really think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that person could never be, even when he seems like he's working for you, he's really not.
Yeah.
By definition.
Well, it's a very negative view of man. I mean, not that we don't need to have negative views of man, but just it's a very flat.
Yeah. And then it teaches that the right thing for me to do is to look out for number one and promote my own self-interest, not related to my family.
Right.
So not only seeing other people as not connected to me, but just acting for themselves, but then seeing myself in that way too.
Yeah, it really does boil down to every man for himself.
Mm-hmm.
When you see it as an extreme. I'm not sure that everyone who originally talked about this meant that. But I think Pink makes a good case that people believed that enough that it skewed their understanding of what was actually happening when it came to things like motivation.
Mm-hmm.
Because within that really narrow definition, there was no room for the person who said no to $2.
Mm-hmm.
But the person saying no to $2 actually reminded me of something, Mystie, that you said your husband, it was advice he gave one time, but he was like, work for pay
Oh, yeah.
or work for, how do they say it?
Work for free or work for dear, but never work for cheap.
There you go. It was so much more clever than the way I was saying it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's funny because I had someone ask me, for the curriculum I write for the school, and someone was shocked when they found out I did it all for free. Why would you do all that for free? And I was like, well, I love this school and I believe in the mission, but also the school could never afford me.
Yeah.
It was like, it's not like I'm going to do a project like this for $100 or something.
Right. That actually devalues the work more than doing it for them for free.
Right. Is there anything more we need to say about anthropology, actually, before we move on to page 66? That was a page I wanted us to really focus on today.
Well, I just wanted to add the caveat to Pink if someone does pick this up, which I do recommend, but it being your typical pop economics book, his anthropology is Darwinistic evolutionary, where like these different kinds of motivations are evolutionary, like humans have developed in these different ways. And so it's just actually false. So just...
Right. Yeah. I was kind of laughing actually when he started with your only motivation in the beginning was biological, and
they're right.
because he believes you came from a monkey. He believes you're a primate. How different from the dignity of man in the garden, where he immediately had, the vision of expanding the garden and domain. Like there was this big vision for the world that was presented to him from the very beginning. And there was a lot of different motivations going into that. Everything from the glory of God at the highest, and then the biological drive to reproduce and take care of your body and that kind of stuff. The whole gamut of everything was there at the very beginning.
Yeah. Right. It's more like this going to or working toward intrinsic motivation is a recovery of the dignity and original purpose of man. It's a going back. It isn't this incremental development that we have now achieved.
Yeah, they think it's new, but Charlotte Mason talked about it almost 100 years before he did. Because when you're a Christian, you already assume there's intrinsic motivation.
Right.
I mean, you can't read the Bible without thinking that someone could be motivated by something like love for another human being or love for God. It's not that everything he's saying is not true. It's just that if we start with the Christian understanding with man, we have so much more to stand upon than he does, where it's like, gosh, we were all shocked 20 years ago to learn that there was another aspect of man. We're like, really? Have you read a book older than 50 years? So they're catching up. But the funny thing is that we, even though, we are Christians and we have this Christian understanding of mankind, we also are raised in the world where this definition of man has been prevalent for so long that it's the water we're swimming in, it's the air that we are breathing. And so we get sucked in to viewing situations as transactional, to being manipulative, to failing to understand that children could have an intrinsic motivation going on. Even though we believe these things on the one hand, on the other hand, it's hard to extract ourselves from our culture.
Yep.
That's why it's still helpful to read a book like Drive. It helps us understand a little bit more of the world that Scripture is trying to tell us about, but we just have these disconnects that come from the world we're being raised in.
Yeah.
To go back just a little bit, sorry, I just had this
go
up,
for it.
When we're talking about manipulation and things like that, like if we believe philosophically that education is not, that bucket to be filled or this, vessel to be shaped by us, right? If we truly believe that education is self-education, then we need to believe also that there is internal motivation, because just shaping and molding these things in a way we want is counter to the belief that education comes from children being exposed to ideas and reading and learning, and making it their own, right? Assimilating it. And that's how motivation is too. It has to become their own.
Right.
In a lot of cases. So
I was thinking about that verse where God says, I am the potter and you are the clay. When we attempt to manipulate our children, we're trying to say they are clay, but I'm the potter.
yeah,
Right.
Instead of saying like, God did put me in authority over these children,
absolutely.
but it's not my job to mold them. He molds them. I give them a safe place to be molded in.
Yeah. And we have an incredible amount of influence.
Right.
That's not what we're talking about, but it is.
And some authority.
Yeah. And authority. Right.
Right.
We don't have the authority to choose their career when they grow up or to, I mean, like there's so many things that we are tempted to do that are outside of our authority.
Yeah. We choose the books they read, but they pick what is going to stick with them when they read it, right? Like they get to take that and make that their own. Yeah.
Okay. Can I read this little paragraph from chapter 2A?
Yes.
Not to be confused with chapter 2. Okay, it's on page 66 for anyone who's following along. It says, so basically he's talking about if you want to set up intrinsic rewards or even a healthy way to, not intrinsic rewards, intrinsic motivation, or even if you want to have a context for healthy external rewards, you have to have this first. So he says your best approach is to have already established the conditions of a genuinely motivating environment. And that sentence right there is why I wanted us to focus on this section, because, it begs the question. So what does a genuinely motivating environment look like? So he says the baseline rewards must be sufficient. Now, this is a business book, so just stay with us, people. That is, the team's basic compensation must be adequate and fair, particularly compared with people doing similar work for similar organizations. Your nonprofit must be a congenial place to work. And the people on your team must have autonomy. They must have ample opportunity to pursue mastery. And their daily duties must relate to a larger purpose. If these elements are in place, the best strategy is to provide a sense of urgency and significance and then get out of the talent's way. I feel like there's a lot in that. So I kind of want us to just walk through it because it is for business. So let's apply this to
family,
like real family life.
I love applying business books to family life.
Right. This is your wheelhouse. So, let's take the first part and have you do it, because I would like to know, he's talking about compensation and we get that. We get how if you're being unfairly paid or if you're being paid at poverty level, about how you've got all sorts of burdens now mixed up with your motivation, even if you're naturally an intrinsically motivated person. We get that for business, but what does it look like in a family to say the baseline rewards are sufficient and your basic compensation is adequate and fair? Like, what does that look like? You don't pay your kids to be your kids.
No, and I think that taking everything back to money is a part of the problematic assumptions about motivation.
Amen.
If we're talking about jobs and a career, particularly a husband's career, it's a part of their responsibility to provide for their family. So the compensation package is important. It's not just like dollars are motivating. It's actually required for him to achieve his goal. What do our kids need as a baseline to achieve their goal? Like, do they have goals? Do they, I don't know. That one of my children's motivations was always having free time. That's just a baseline human desire and reasonable. And so the way that I have set up their responsibilities and their work, does it allow them a proper amount of free time and the resources to use that free time well and rewardingly? Free time, food, adequate food, adequate hygiene, adequate exercise. These are kind of the baseline. Do they have what they need to operate as whole people?
I like that. I remember Early on in my homeschooling, there was, I can't even remember what it was called now, but there was sort of this large family organization type. I don't know. It was like a way of thinking because I saw it on multiple blogs, but it was basically like you're going to dictate every moment of your child's day, and that's going to help you have control over this large amount of children that you have.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember reading, I guess this way of thinking had been around long enough that there were some people who had grown up in it and then were adults. And I remember reading some of the adults talking about how, like, as children, it was like, what is the point? Because you never got your own time. You never got any freedom. You never got any autonomy, is the word he uses in the chapter. But it was very demotivating to them because there was always the next thing that mom was going to make me do. They never got to make any choices for their own self. And it was just super interesting because I never really thought about it that way. I mean, I just am naturally not a super controlling person. So like, that's not a struggle that I have. But it was interesting to look at the extreme where someone was raised where there was lots of heavy-handed control. I could see resentment. I could predict resentment, but to see the demotivation spelled out was really interesting.
Yeah, I think we might begin with the assumption that if my kids practice doing the right things, then they will grow up doing the right things, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way that I get the end that I want, which is them making good choices, is by having them practice doing the right thing. And I'm going to tell them what the right things are every single time and make sure that they do the right things. That kind of controlling, outcome-based focus. And the emphasis really should be more on the choosing. If you want them to be adults that choose to do the right thing, like they have to practice choosing and experience the consequences of making choices. And if they've never actually made any choices, that's what's going to make them unprepared for adulthood.
Yeah, I had a gal, I was teaching a Charlotte Mason class on the way of the will and on giving choices to children. We talked about what was age appropriate and different things, but it was someone who had kind of been raised that way with a domineering mother was more the issue than a system. But I remember her saying that as an adult, she couldn't choose her own clothes. She didn't know what she even liked because everything had been chosen for her. Now in adulthood, she's trying to do this work that's really a work of childhood to discover what you like and dislike is a pretty basic thing about childhood that she totally didn't get to develop. And she had a hard time making choices about everything. It was really, again, interesting to see an extreme. You don't usually run across extremes like that extreme.
Right.
Kids are developing as they're doing these things. And it's easy to just think, it's most efficient is that I know the answer. And so I just choose for them because that's going to be really fast. And that is fast with a 2-year-old, but they're not 2 forever.
Mm-hmm.
We get into these habits of this is what works really great with the pre-K crowd. And we forget that now they're in the middle of elementary school ages.
Yeah.
It should look very different, just like it should look very different again when they're teenagers.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I do love like kind of the next line though.
Mm-hmm.
Your nonprofit, which I would say homes are very for profit, right? We're supposed to be turning a profit, right? But your nonprofit must be a congenial place to work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that goes back to mom's attitude is the atmosphere of the home, right? We do need to really work on making sure that it is a congenial place to work and live.
Yeah.
Right? Bitterness, resentment, angry mom, like these are all things we need to drive away. And that actually builds up a baseline right there. That congeniality or, right, Mystie, conviviality, right?
That's right.
That's really something that has, like, it's just a sentence, but I think that's a big, big part of it.
I like that. And I've seen ways where in the past I have ruined the atmosphere with my attitude or whatever. And then it does affect the children. Like we'd like to think that they're immune to our bad attitudes or whatever, but they're not.
No. Little sponges.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then I'll get frustrated because I see someone treating someone else this way, but it's like, oh, but this is how I acted since I got up this morning.
Yep. Little mirrors. Well, and I think that ties to the last sentence in this excerpt that you pulled out, which is just it says, and then get out of the talent's way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is a business book, but I think that word choice right there was deliberate. This isn't employees' way, it's the talent's way.
Right.
So instead of seeing the person as someone who's supposed to be doing exactly what you're telling them, an employee,
Mm-hmm.
you're seeing them as someone with talent,
Mm-hmm.
someone who has something they're offering and giving that's theirs. It's not just, this is a cog in my machine.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to the congenial place to work, I think. It's like, I get the anthropology. How do we view our children? What are they in our household?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So there's 3 elements that he says go into this. They must have autonomy. They must have ample opportunity to pursue mastery. And then their daily duties must relate to a larger purpose. That looks different depending on the age of the children.
Sure.
But can you guys give some examples of those 3 things in action?
Well, I think first on autonomy, I think a clarification. I've heard this word used 2 different ways. And so I think clarifying what he's talking about, and this does seem to be the general dictionary definition, which is basically self-governing. Someone with autonomy can be self-controlled. They don't have to be controlled by outside forces. They can be self-controlled, and they have agency, basically. They have the ability to choose.
Yes.
And then I have heard the word used, I think in Failure of Nerve, autonomy is used this way to distinguish. Autonomy there is used to describe someone who's disconnected, entirely self-contained.
Yeah.
And I've heard it used in that way in other contexts too. So I think just clarifying what he's referring to, someone who has agency, not someone who's entirely self-referential and not and disconnected from the whole family.
Yeah, he calls them the people on the team. So they should still be on the team.
A team.
And that means, I mean, honestly, if you're still on the team, then you're also trying to execute probably a mission that wasn't necessarily determined by yourself.
Right.
But you have creative capacity to do it how you want to do it, like within reasonable bounds, right? That's the thing.
Yeah, like one of his examples, he's trying to get people to create a poster, like a marketing poster, right? He wants this great poster. And then how would you go about getting, let's say you have a team of graphic designers or whatever. How would you go about getting the best work from them? And so there's like, you could pay them extra, you could do a contest, you could do, whatever. But with the autonomy part would not be that they choose whether or not to do a poster.
Right.
But they're going to design it without a whole lot of input. They're trying to make the best poster they can. They're not trying to execute the exact vision of the boss. They're just trying to execute the poster. I was thinking about that, just setting up new chore things at the house. It's a new house. We need a new processes and all that. And so I've been working on cleaning schedules and that kind of stuff. And then my vacuum broke, so that's fun. But I was just thinking about how, especially at these ages, I'm really moving to, this is the list. It has to be done on this day. Have a good time.
Yeah.
Obviously, I wouldn't have done that with small children, but, trying to give the job, but be as hands-off as I can.
Right. And all the training that you've done up until this point has built that ability in them to be able to handle that level of responsibility.
Yeah.
I mean, in homeschooling, I think this would include things like, here's the checklist. I don't care what order you do it in.
Yeah.
They also graduate from that to, here's the checklist for the week.
Right.
Decide what day and decide. I was like, yeah, they're going to make some poor choices, but that's actually a part of the education, is experiencing the consequences of their choices.
Yep.
Yeah. That was huge too. Handing over, like switching from a daily to a weekly checklist was huge for my kids, because they really had to learn to manage time in a very different way than when they had it all broken up for them. And I didn't really think of that as developing college skills or whatever. But it is true. Like most college stuff either comes as a semester or comes paced out a week at a time or a month at a time or whatever. And the ability to try to figure that out, probably easier to figure that out in high school versus having to figure that out in college when you're like living on your own. There's so many other new things.
Well, and 4 years of high school is ample opportunity to pursue mastery in managing your time, right? Like that's a
Oh,
great
good point.
for it.
Mm-hmm.
What about daily duties relating to a larger purpose? I mean, is that the kind of thing that you think you communicate directly? Like, are you giving motivational speeches first thing in the morning?
I mean, what is it? You got to have your I have a dream speech when ready in your back pocket, right? From failure of nerve.
I have a dream of a greenhouse with a vacuum that works.
Yeah. I do think that as they get older, more direct talking about that is helpful. I think in the younger years, it's easy to read books that, don't necessarily make sense to them. Like there's a lot less pushback. But as they get older, they're like, well, now why am I reading poetry? Or, why are we learning a foreign language that no one speaks? Why, because they are asking, like, how does this relate to a larger purpose? And I do think that we do need to cast a vision for those things because otherwise we're just making them do busy work. And I've told my children over and over again, I don't make you do stupid things. I make sure that I'm doing things that are worthy of your time. And I think that they've heard from their older siblings who have gone on to do other school. They're like, oh no, mom doesn't make you do stupid things. So it's, that's a nice thing to say. Like, yeah, we have to do this stupid project. And then they complain. And then I'm like, see, I've never made you do something stupid like that. So sorry, it's probably a bad attitude, but it's working for us.
I've even told my kids before when they've complained or started complaining regularly or whatever, I can't make you be an educated person, but I can make sure that you have the chance to be an educated person. So this is me giving you that chance.
Yes.
I am not going to actually spell out exactly why Latin is important to me. Or whatever it is. You know what I mean? But I can say this, that a truly educated person has these opportunities and takes advantage of them. So then you get to decide. You get to decide how educated you're actually going to be.
Mm-hmm. And they're going to be ready for that responsibility at different times.
Mm-hmm.
And for those that aren't acting responsibly with that choice, you have to assess as their mom, do they just need to learn this lesson the hard way? And how can I make that hard way consequence, happen now? Where we're still at the point where there's time for recovery, where they can get the point themselves. Or, what kind of guardrails is it my responsibility to still hold and maintain at this point in their life?
Mm-hmm.
I would say probably for you, Brandy, you can say that to your children because you've also cut off the path of stupid things. They don't have the option of spending all their time on social media instead.
Mm-hmm.
That's true.
Or spending all their time on video game, things that are addicting and demotivating. Those aren't an option. So they're basically going to be bored or educated.
That's true. Mm-hmm.
So you laid out the path.
Or tried to anyway. we'll see.
Working so far.
So it says here, if you have these three things, so the autonomy, the opportunity to pursue mastery, which, I really appreciate that you brought up free time, Mystie, because I've often joked that, we do serious homeschooling in the morning so that we can unschool in the afternoon. But really, that was my thought, that if you fill them up with enough good things, then they have fruitful things to do in that free time, right? Because what we don't want are kids that don't have anything to think about and don't know how to do anything, having lots of free time, because, there's a reason why we say idle hands are the devil's plaything. So we have to make this environment where boredom can be a healthy thing for kids.
Right.
So they have the opportunity to pursue mastery. They have the autonomy. They have their daily duties related to a larger purpose. And he says, if these elements are in place, the best strategy is provide a sense of urgency and significance and then get out of their way. So what is that like? What does a sense of urgency look like?
I think that's one of the hardest pieces for us to have in our homeschools. It becomes easier as they get older, letting them have things like jobs or other things outside the house. For us, this has also been like the ability to play with friends in the afternoon because they actually had, friends on the same street. So I didn't have to transport them to friends. They knew their friend was working to get their school done. They were working to get their school done so that they could play in the afternoon. Like they made plans with their friends. That provided the sense of urgency, like feeling like someone else is counting on you to show up, after lunch or whatever. I don't know how I could have provided a sense of urgency outside of that.
One of the things that we as adults works well, and it does work with children too, is that accountability is motivating. And that can be part of it too, right?
Yeah.
If you're not doing your work, then you're going to have to talk to dad. That's usually, it sounds like a threat, but it's just really does sometimes help with the sense of urgency and significance. You're going to have to explain to your dad why you weren't obeying, right?
That's true.
And so I do think that that's the negative side of it too. But there are natural things like my kids loved to go to work with my husband. And that was one of the senses of urgency too. Like, well, if you get it done, you can go help dad, and that's
something that they are looking forward to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, I remember when my older two were in elementary and just kind of dawdling on the morning chores. And my goal was that the morning chores were done before we started school. They didn't really have a sense of urgency about starting school. So they didn't have a sense of urgency about their morning things. And it could be very drawn out. And so instead of nagging and prodding, I said, okay, if your morning things are done before, I forget if it was like 7 or 8 or something, then you'll have time to make tea for yourself. And you can have a cup of tea while we do morning time. But if you don't finish your morning things by 8, then you can't make tea. So you have to have time to make the tea. So I'd get that out so they could see it and said, okay, well, if you have enough time, you can have a cup of tea, but otherwise we're just going to have to get going. And if you haven't finished your morning things, then you're going to have to go back and finish it, but we're starting. So to just have that sense of there is something good, it's a reward. It's a kind of reward. Something good is going to happen if I work in a timely fashion. There's payoff for doing that. And not doing that, I can see that I have pushed my work back and now I have more to do in this after morning time. I have to use school time now to do my chores because I didn't finish in time. I'm not just pushing back school time. I actually have to use school time to do chores. Just communicating that sense of time. It's kind of a tricky thing to work out in those elementary years, but that was one thing that helped us.
I think deadlines in general can help. There was a type of motivation. I think that was a sense of urgency. I never thought about it using that word before, but in our co-op, there was one of the classes was recitation. And the teachers would just say, you need to have something chosen by next time you come. You need to be ready to do this by the next time you come. And I just talk about out of their way. Half the time I didn't know what was going on. But, that sense of urgency was I'm going to show up and in front of all of these people, I'm going to have to explain why I don't have my selection chosen or I'm not ready to recite my thing or, whatever it is. No one was putting any pressure. It was just the structure of the class itself, I think, provided like a low level sense of urgency because I suppose ultimately they didn't want to be embarrassed or have to explain themselves.
Yeah.
Positive peer pressure.
Yeah. I see this now. I don't know how this would have worked when kids were little, but now I have basically a set time within 15 minutes or so when I start our group lessons in the morning. So it's like 7:45 is what I'm aiming for. If they want to eat breakfast before then, they have to do that. If they want to have their math done before that, they have to get up whenever in order to have whatever done before I start because they know that that's non-negotiable. When I'm ready to go, they have to be ready to go. And so I just see them, figuring out their day, deciding what time they want to be done and working backwards. And sometimes they're up really early. Like, I can't believe how early they're up, but it's just because we bought an ATV and they want to do certain things in the afternoon. So anyway, I think having a set time where something has to happen, kind of like you were saying with the tea, it does have that urgency there.
Mm-hmm.
Getting out of their way, I think that part can be tricky with little kids because it's hard to know how much to get out of their way when they're still so small, But I wonder if maybe the guiding principle there is we get as out of their way as we can.
Well, as is age appropriate.
Right, exactly. So it looks different in every age, but the goal is for them to have as much freedom as they can, whatever that looks like for them. And because it's not just their age, even it's their maturity level. Like I definitely have, certain children that were ready for things way earlier than others to the point where like other kids were offended. And it's like, sorry, I didn't actually make this decision based upon age, right? So, okay. So he said after all those things are in place, then you might be able to boost performance with the delicate use of rewards. And does anyone want to explain what delicate use looks like?
I think this is kind of like the tea in my previous example, where it's not like, it's kind of an if-then setup. If you do this, then you get this. But it's also kind of tied to the work because it's a little perk that will help the next thing. Like you get to have something extra enjoyable while we're doing the work. It's tied to the next thing that we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just adding a little bit of extra fun and enjoyment. It's not like, okay, so here is your totally disconnected reward that is teaching you to work for, basically pay.
Yeah. On 66, he says any extrinsic reward should be unexpected and offered only after the task is complete. But I feel like he doesn't have a category for what you're talking about, Mystie, because that idea of reward that's tied to the work itself. So having the tea while you're doing the next job makes the next job more enjoyable and more rewarding feeling than without it. I remember having a child where it was a quote, if then situation, but not like what he's talking about.
Right.
It was a child who was like, I really want to learn cursive. And I'm like, your printing is atrocious.
Yeah.
And so I basically said, you can earn cursive. You work and get your printing under control, and then we'll go straight to cursive. It's not an age thing. It's a readiness thing. And so you show me, and I know some people do cursive first, blah, 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 whatever, but it totally worked.
Right.
And he got what he wanted, and I got what I wanted, which was printing that I could read. That really isn't a category that I'm seeing in the book.
Right. And that's tied, I think that has the significance element.
Yeah.
And mastery, because those are connected in that it's very clear, even to a child, that, being able to improve your handwriting in one way will obviously be a stepping stone to improve it in the other way. So even while you're working on the if part, the work part that you didn't want to do, you're seeing that activity itself is getting you toward your goal.
So in some jobs, you'll get a promotion where you get more financial pay. But at least in watching my husband, sometimes the motivation is more that you got more responsibility. Like, you got more pay, but the pay itself really wasn't what was significant about it. It was that you got to do something new or more interesting or more challenging. The work itself, the next work was the motivation.
Yeah.
In the if-then equation.
Yeah, my kids are motivated by that too. The more responsibility. And it seems to be like better jobs, right? Barn work wise, it's like the tasks that anyone can do. yeah, we have to do it. But when you kind of graduate, you get to do way more fun things like drive chariots and go catch lambs. That's the ultimate job, not just feeding and watering. So yeah, I do see that too.
And I think he doesn't see some of those options because he's still actually operating with a mechanistic view of man, even though he's moving out of it and he's trying to help people move out of it. I think the fundamental evolutionary assumption keeps him trapped to not see that utilitarianism was never actually motivating in the first place. It's not like we're moving beyond that. It's that was
significance,
not a full view of man. Yeah.
He even claims it, right? Like significance, purpose, right? Those are things that are motivating to us, not just being useful or.
Yeah, he sees that, but he doesn't actually have objective sense of significance because there is no objective outside of us significance or meaning under an evolutionary worldview.
Yeah, that's interesting because he talks about non-tangible rewards like praise and positive feedback. And I don't respond to those at all. It frustrates my husband because I just would rather not be praised for anything. I just find it irritating. But I think actually it's because I want something to have more significance than a pat on the back and a good job, which kind of sounds dumb. But at the same time, for me, that reward falls kind of flat. And I know some people really like feedback. They really like praise or all that. But I felt the significance portion, I think, is actually what I'm looking for.
Right.
I want to know that it mattered. Which, that's what he's saying earlier. Daily duties must relate to a larger purpose. But then he doesn't really flesh that out, I don't think, with what rewards look like. So I don't know. I don't want to get too off track with this. Have you guys seen or have you personally used rewards in a way that you think is beneficial or it fits into this framework somehow?
Yes.
Yep. Abby has a good example.
Okay. So years ago, we did annual chores and always the worst chore was dishes, right? 7 people and everyone eats like hobbits. So the dishes galore. I mean, we've gone through so many dishwashers. I can't even tell you how many because we burn them out because we use them so much. But dishes is kind of like the worst. And so my child, who shall remain nameless, hated it the most. And that person is kind of a wheeler dealer and always looking for an angle, which is great. It's very creative. And so they asked, if I don't complain about dishes for the entire year, will you pay me for $100 as a reward? And we don't pay for chores. Like, you're part of the family. You make the mess. You have to be part of this. And, we've been on this yearly rotation. It stinks for the year, but then you don't have it for, 4 or 5 years. Like, it's not a bad deal. And so my husband and I talked about it and we're like, yeah, we'll do that. We'll even give you 3 mess up days because everybody has a day where, attitudes happen, right? Like, we understand this. We are not perfect beings. With that child, we got about 3 months and then they decided that, nope, not worth the $100. I want to complain. Totally fine. But we roll around to our next year and the next child in line said, is the same deal still an option? And we're like, yeah, go for it. Totally paid that kid $100. I think they had one day where it was a complaint, but it was really my attitude that made it a problem. So funny. I was like, I'm going to apologize to you and you get an extra, day of complaining if you need to. Didn't mean it. That kid just went for it. Totally worth the $100. Next year, the next kid was like, still the same deal. We're like, yeah, this is working. And guess what? Not a complaint. And it really just changed the atmosphere of our home about dishes. It made me complain less about dishes. It made pretty much everyone. And then we could, compliment them and give them feedback. Like, look at this. your youngest siblings could manage this because they had control over their tongue and their, attitudes. So just so you know, it is possible. We've seen it. Now repeat it. And then the next person did it too. So we got like 3 solid years of not one single complaint about dishes. Totally worth $300, in my opinion. Not to mention, it just showed them. And that's like a very delayed gratification, right? And that wasn't paying for the work, but it was connected to the work. And, we memorized, do everything without grumbling, complaining, right? Like this is something that we do try to instill in our children. But that was like the showdown of the habit of the ordering of, because we've talked about this, that we were talking about, like we're ordering the affections. And they were choosing to do this long, hard thing for a reward, but ultimately, they're so proud of the fact that they did it for a year without complaining.
So they actually experienced intrinsic motivation.
Yes, absolutely.
I think there are a couple reasons why that fits into the proper or a working use of rewards rather than the like bribery manipulation.
Yeah.
And so one, you didn't come up with the idea.
Mm-hmm.
No.
So it was not a bribe because it wasn't your idea.
Nope.
2, it was long-term. This is not a quick fix. It is delayed gratification. And it was just a significant thing to look forward to, a recognition of a goal achieved that made it memorable.
Yeah.
And worth pushing through those times where they really, didn't feel like it. And plus, probably that second and third kid were actually just trying to prove to the sibling.
Yes.
Like it was
Absolutely.
actually more of a rivalry, competition than about the money.
Yeah, it had very little to do with money. And
right.
My kids do work and they do have sheep. So like money is not a super big motivator for them. Like it has to be a significant amount. $100 really isn't.
Right.
Like that was the secondary thing. Like it was enough to make them keep their eye on the prize, but it is a nice reward for the hard work, but it
was more like providing proof that they had done it.
Yes.
Right. I think someone could hear the story and be like, well, that's not what he said in the chapter. But I was thinking about how there's a place where he talks about things that turn work into play.
Yeah.
And about how bribes or a lot of extrinsic rewards that are manipulation turn play into work, especially if you take something that someone's already doing well and then you pay them for it. Then it kind of backfires because their long-term interest in that thing kind of wanes. The part that's missing is that because they initiated it, like Mystie said, and because there was like so much sibling competitiveness going on here, that really it took that work and turned it into a game.
Right.
So it was like a long-term competition.
Yeah.
Really. And I think that's why it worked.
And no one felt manipulated.
Right.
Right. Well, that's where it's worth pointing out that it really isn't about the technique of reward versus not reward. It is about that congenial place to work. It is about how you're using your atmosphere and your environment.
Right.
And so the same, like someone else could use $100 to, do the job in such a way that it would be a bribe and manipulating.
Absolutely.
Because it's really about it's about the approach and the atmosphere. It's not about the $100.
Right.
I do have another example. So our church is having right now a parenting class, and a local pastor who raised 8 children and has been in the same church for, decades. He's doing the class for our church. So he's big on rewards, almost to a point I'm like, I don't know about that. And he's like, well, what's your method? And he's like, I think I'll stick with mine. It's working. But one of the things that he used to do with his kids, and he said that worked so much better. And I think that Daniel Pink's book this is kind of a good direction to go. But he said if there was any issue coming up, conflict or something that needed to be worked on, he would always take them out to eat or out to a neutral place and spend some money. He said that was kind of the key, like almost like a date. You take them out, you talk to them on neutral territory. I'm sure there's some art of war, something in there, Brandy.
What type of ground is that?
Yeah, what type of ground, but like some neutral ground. And then he would ask his kids, say the thing was grades. I know most of us are homeschooled and we don't give grades, but for the sake of this was his example. He would say, all right, what is your goal here? And he would ask his kid. And he said he's never taken any one of his 8 children out where their goals were less than what he would have asked them. But because they came up with their own goals, and he said, okay, great. So that's your goals. Let's say it's like straight A's and 1B or something like that. He goes, great. I love those goals. Is there anything you need from me to help you, kind of things? And he said, okay, so if you meet your goal, I will pay you $100. If you don't meet your goal, you pay me $100 or whatever the money was. But I think that it goes along with what we're saying is like their baseline is there, right? And the kid chose the goal. He set the bar, and then the rewards were just, or the consequences were just a side part of it. I think that intrinsic motivation is this kid did know he wanted to do something. He set a goal, and then the dad came in for accountability and reward or, consequences. So I don't know. I've been still
more like, it's again, more like recognition really than like a bribe.
Yeah. And he said he didn't, I don't think he mentioned that any of his kids missed the mark. Like they almost always did above and beyond. They were just so motivated to do this, to meet this goal.
And this is where I think even translating this down to younger years and sticker charts, it isn't necessarily about yes or no on sticker charts. It's about how, as a mom, are you operating? Do you see the work as valuable in and of itself?
Mm-hmm.
And do you see your child as capable of internal motivation, intrinsic motivation? Or do you think the work is dumb? Or your child is incapable of enjoying it? It really comes down to your anthropology,
right?
And your idea of the work itself as well. So if you think the work is not meaningful or enjoyable in and of itself, then you feel like you have to add something to it to make it enjoyable. Or if you think your child isn't capable of liking it, they're actually going to pick up on that. You're going to be demonstrating in your use of the technique what you actually think about the situation. And that's what you're going to be inculcating. Or if you think the work is valuable and you think your child is capable of enjoying it, you can use the sticker chart to just add a level of recognition and tracking and accountability. So it really isn't about the sticker chart in and of itself. It's really digging deeper and asking yourself, well, what do I think about this work? I know when we were just first starting to homeschool and I was reading a whole bunch of educational philosophy, I just actually did not believe that there was a natural intrinsic desire to know. When I started out with the assumption that it's my job to make them do the work that they don't want to do, then strategies that are basically manipulation and bribing make sense.
Right.
And it will demotivate, and I will get what I'm looking for, which is a child who doesn't want to know because I'm operating from the assumption that they don't want to know. So I'm going to be treating them that way. And that's what they're going to learn. And it turns out that actually humans do want to know things and they do like growing and receiving responsibility. So,
well, and kids even like the feeling of having work that contributed to the welfare of the family.
Right.
A sticker chart can be used like a checklist where you're just keeping track of what's going on.
Right.
In death by sticker chart, what we were talking about were the ones where it's like, we don't think that the job, like you said, Misty, has any real value. So the only value that we can think of is that they get to earn something. And because you're little, it's not money, it's some toy that you want or whatever. But it's turning it into this transactional relationship.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember way back then saying like, and I knew someone who had done this, and her child's attitude was, well, what are you going to give me for it? Whenever she asked him to do anything.
Right.
She had trained him inadvertently that the only reason that he could possibly have for contributing to the family was because he got something out of it.
Right. Operating from the assumption that each person is mostly motivated by self-interest. And so you're doing something to try to tap into their self-interest.
Right.
And what you're doing is actually teaching them to operate from self-interest.
The big caution that comes to mind in all of this is in the story of the children who were rewarded for drawing. And so they basically did this experiment where they tested kids, and kids were freely choosing to draw in a classroom. Then they set up a situation where they're rewarded to draw. Then they see what happens when they go back into a situation where they would freely choose or not choose to draw. And it was basically the ones that received the reward, their interest declined greatly. With all of this, one of the things that we have to be careful of is introducing rewards when they're not necessary. Those kids were already drawing. There was no reason to even think about rewarding anybody for drawing. They were picking up paper and drawing on their own. All the reward did was change the child's relationship with drawing into something that was transactional and therefore no longer intrinsically rewarding. And so I really do think when we see kids that are motivated in their own way, that's where providing the sense of urgency and significance and getting out of the way is at its most powerful, I think.
Yeah.
Because they're already there. And we can just trust that that is going to drive them. It's like the child, I've told this story before, I think, the child that I actually eliminated some of the natural history, nature-y type reading out of the curriculum because she was obsessed and on her own time was spending so much. And it was like, I don't need to add this to the curriculum because she's reading every book in the house on her own. There are times when we can get out of the way, even in really extreme ways. But like, I didn't do that for anybody else because nobody else was reading like that.
Right. Well, and that's where it is mom's job to observe and exercise wisdom for each child.
Yes.
To help them develop into responsible free agents.
Yeah.
All right. Brandy, do you see that Abby has to go?
Oh, I didn't see that, but okay.
Very soon. Sorry.
Thank you both for coming. This has been a really fun conversation and so much to think about.
Yes. Thanks, Brandy. See ya.
Thanks. Bye.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Please make sure you are following us on your favorite podcast player so that you don't miss our upcoming episodes. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with a friend and then discuss it with her. This is a great way to continue the conversation. All of the books and things we mentioned today are linked in our show notes. Just go to scolasisters.com/SS140 to check it out. Don't forget to register for our spring training sessions with Andrew Zwerneman on teaching history classically. He is truly a master teacher and you are going to love this training. If you are a Sophie member of the sistership, these sessions are included for you free of charge. If you are not a Sophie member, head on over to scolasisters.com/history and register. That's scolasisters.com/history. Our next episode is all about raising kids who love to learn. I think this episode will surprise you. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
I'm going to go shut my door and lock it. So, maybe we won't get interrupted.
They're not actually in the house. So I don't think there's going to be hammering in the middle of this recording.
If we can weather my husband shooting things in the front yard, we can weather a little bit of.
I mean, this is true.
But the Pro Gym went really well today. So that's what all I was sharing because it is so fun that I get to teach it though in different places. So
that is something I've been missing, teaching other people's children who act really into what I'm saying.
well,
my kids aren't impressed at all by me.
yeah, I know. That's
so discouraging.